You're listening to episode 101 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. On today's show, we are going on another culinary journey, this time to Mississippi, where my guest, registered dietitian and food writer, Sadé Meeks, explores the history of African-American cuisine. Now, are we biting off more than we can chew on this episode? Perhaps we are, but we are going to do our best to explore the foods, traditional cooking methods, and recipes that define African-American cuisine today. Now, Sadé, like me, her love for food started in the kitchen with her mom while she was growing up in Jackson, Mississippi. And that love of food blossomed and led her to pursue a bachelor's degree in culinary arts from Mississippi University for Women and a master's degree in nutrition science from California State University in Los Angeles. Today, Sadé is the executive director of her nonprofit called Growing Resilience in the South. And the short name for that is GRITS. I love that. GRITS was founded in 2017, and its mission is to improve communities' health and well-being through increased awareness of nutrition, food history, and culture. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited for this conversation. And I hope nobody is hungry because together, Sadé and I are going to talk about some of her recipes, which I adore. She's got a recipe for smoky collard greens and shrimp and grits. It's just comfort food. It's so good. All right. Before we get started, a few friendly reminders. If you love the show, tell a friend about it or post a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on lizshealthytable.com. Be sure to check out the show notes from today's show for all of the recipes and the resources discussed. And follow me on Instagram at Liz Weiss. And now let me bring Sadé Meeks into the conversation. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk more about African-American cuisine.
Fantastic. And now I did say you're in Mississippi, and you still are in Mississippi, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I've been all over the place, but I'm back home now.
You're back home. I've never been to Mississippi. I think I've been to every state in the country except for 4 states. And now I'm at the point where I can't remember which 4 I've not been to, but I've definitely not been to Mississippi.
Really? Well, you have to come one day for sure.
I will come if you will make dinner for me.
Shrimp and grits. Oh, we try something else.
Yeah, make something else. I've been making your shrimp and grits.
Yeah, we can try something else.
We will. So let's just start by telling everybody a little bit about where you live. We know you live in Mississippi, your interests, just a little bit about your life. And then we'll get into career and we'll get into cuisine.
Okay, well, my name is Sadé Meeks. I come from a really big family. I'm one of 6. I have a twin sister. We grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. After I graduated high school, I attended Mississippi University for Women, where I studied culinary arts and got my bachelor's degree in culinary arts. But I've always been a nerd. And so the part I liked the most about my culinary arts experience was just like the science of food and just learning, about that mission part of it. We had a couple, classes on nutrition, but it wasn't extensive. But that food science and that microbiology and those classes were my favorite. So I wanted to explore it deeper, and I knew nutrition was the direction I wanted to go in. And so they really prompted me to pursue a master's degree in nutritional science. And so I do have family in California, in the Long Beach, Carson Company area. And so I always wanted to just get closer to that side of my family. My dad's sisters live out there. And so that was one reason why I decided to attend California State University of Los Angeles, where I got my MS in nutritional science. And it was a new world for me. I honestly didn't know much about dietetics. I didn't really know what a dietitian did. which is crazy, but it just kind of goes back. We probably may talk about it or may not, but it just kind of goes back to like the access and just increasing access to dietitians, which is what I'm doing with grits, which I'll probably talk more about. But like as growing up, I never even had contact with dietitians. And like being on the other side of it, like I have this different perspective and, you know, I want to advocate for more access for that just because growing up, I didn't even know. And like even when I got into grad school, I barely knew what a dietitian did until the director of the program just kind of invited me into this world. And I was sold. I knew this was the path I wanted to go along. And so the rest is history.
Fantastic. And, you know, you definitely know cooking. You definitely know nutrition. And just so everybody knows that Sadé and I met during the Culinary Nutrition Collaborative. This was like a 9-week program I took part in over the winter, where every week we would connect with a different dietitian from a different cultural background, and we would cook. And so when we connected with you and we learned about African American cuisine, the history. And when we made these recipes, I was like so blown away because they were so yummy. And so we will definitely get, you know, we were going to get deep into those recipes, you know, for sure. But why don't you tell, before we get into like African American cuisine and that history, why don't you just tell everybody about grits? Like, what is grits? What's the mission?
So GRITS, as you mentioned, stands for Growing Resilient South, and its mission is to improve the health and well-being of communities through an increased awareness of nutrition, food history, and culture. And I know like food history and culture aren't like things that are heavily talked about in dietetics. So that's what I want to just make always something that's talked about at the same time together because they're so interconnected. And so talking about foodways and things of that nature and really bridging that gap between nutrition and culture. What I learned is through a lot of systemic practices, this gap that exists between nutrition and culture isn't natural. It has been perpetuated by things like systemic racism. And so what GRITS is doing is trying to bridge that gap and close it because there shouldn't be a gap between nutrition and culture. We should see the inherent qualities about cultural foods and not, demonize the way we cook or the way we see our cultural food. So that's what really GRITS is trying to do from a really historical perspective and food history lens, as well as a nutrition.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned looking through that lens. You know, it reminds me, you know, you talk about this gap between culture and nutrition, and we see it all over the place. You know, an example is years ago, my sister had gone to the doctor. She had high cholesterol. She calls me up crying after she sees the doctor. I'm like, what's the matter? She says, he gave me this list. Didn't see a dietitian. He gave me this list of what I'm supposed to eat now, you know, this low fat, fat-free diet. She says, there is nothing on this list I can eat. So what did she do? Threw the list away. She said, forget it. I can't do it. So when when a dietitian or a doctor or a health professional says to someone, oh, you have to eat this way versus the way you've always eaten, it's like, it's an immediate fail. I mean, is that kind of what you're talking about? Like, you can't just look at someone and say, you must eat this way without knowing what they grew up eating.
Right. And I think that goes back to the lack of cultural competence and cultural humility within the healthcare field in general, within dietetics too, and within, doctors and nurses. And so what GRITS is doing with a webinar series that we launched is trying to promote that cultural competency within the field of dietetics by educating nutrition professionals of what cultural foods look like and how they can incorporate them in their meal planning sessions with their clients, or how they can, just make sure they're being sensitive to their cultural needs and not just their nutrition needs as well.
Right. Yeah. We want people to be successful, right?
Right.
So let's talk about African American cuisine. Let's get into this culture. You know, I've done podcasts exploring. We had Lourdes Castro on a few weeks ago, and she explored Cuban cuisine, and she was another one of the dietitian chefs at the Culinary Nutrition Collaborative. And it was just so much fun. It's actually been fun for me to explore and expand my repertoire because, I get bored with the same stuff over and over again anyway, right? So I don't think a lot of people that really understand African American cuisine, and there's a lot to unpack, and we cannot talk for hours and hours because people will be like, come on, girls, get to the, let's do this. So let's just give like maybe sort of a big picture, starting with some just sort of high level insights on the history, maybe some of the predominant foods, maybe starting with like indigenous West African crops and cooking styles, and then how it kind of migrated over here
Yeah.
during that period of slavery.
Yeah, so you're right. The West African culture really influenced so much of African American cuisine. Really started during the Middle Passage, where when West Africans were forcefully removed from their homelands and brought to the Americas. And with that, they didn't just bring their bodies, they brought their knowledge, ways to prepare food, ways to utilize food, and they were able to still, use some foods that they were familiar with, but then they had to adapt to new foods. For instance, the sweet potato was one food that they adapted to in America, because yams were more common in West Africa, but the sweet potato was more common in North America. But because they were so similar, they were able to easily adapt to this new crop, and they were able to prepare the sweet potato in a similar way that they did the yam. And other indigenous crops that made their way to North America, were okra, black-eyed peas, and so those were really main crops that we see now today in African American cuisine. These crops were able to really influence the African American cuisine. They were able to be grown in the United States. They were very resilient crops. Black-eyed peas, for instance, are very resistant to drought. And so many of the enslaved Africans were brought to the South. And so, it can get hot in the South, but this crop was able to grow in this heat because it was resistant to drought. So the ability to grow certain crops was another reason why certain foods were able to just have an impact and remain part of the African American cuisine. And so those are some of the staple crops. As slavery went on, we'll see that the enslaved diet, it was very monotonous. The slave masters fed slaves different things depending on the region. So we can, like I said, it's too much to unpack, but the enslaved diet differed based off the region. For instance, on the southern coastal parts, there were fish in the enslaved diet because they had more access to fish. However, in the deep South, there was more corn and hominy and pork were really foundational parts of the enslaved diet. And so it was very monotonous. But enslaved ancestors were able to really show their strong food literacy skills, I like to think, and be really creative. And they were able to forage and grow foods in their own gardens. And so because they had limited resources given to them, they made their own resources. And so a lot of the enslaved had their own gardens where they grew kale and collard greens and mustard greens and a lot tomatoes and things of that nature. And so that's where I think a lot of the heavy plant-based foods that we see in African-American cuisine came from, because they had to grow their food. And so I think that's a misconception too. A lot of times when people hear African-American cuisine, they think of the unhealthy parts of it, like maybe the stereotypical fried chicken and mac and cheese. But the cuisine is really heavily plant-based. And so that's one characteristic of African-American cuisine. Another thing that kind of influenced African-American cuisine from the West African culture was just those one-pot meals and stews and of that nature. So we see things like gumbo in the African-American cuisine. Also, the idea of pairing a starch with a sauce. And so that's what we see with the shrimp and grits, always having a starch and some type of sauce with it and a protein. So that meal structure kind of influenced certain dishes within the African-American cuisine as well. And it continued to evolve post-slavery. African-American cuisine evolved because they had access to greater resources too. They were able to migrate to different regions of the United States and were able to be influenced by other regions of the United States. So during the Great Migration, we see another evolution of African-American cuisine. We also, during the Harlem Renaissance, we also see another evolution of the African-American cuisine. And like I said, it's a lot to unpack. And this is basically a story. I love to think of the African-American cuisine as a story. It's a food story, and it's what I'm unpacking in the webinar series that I mentioned earlier. It launched a 10-part 8-part series of called Food as Resistance. And through this webinar series, we are exploring this long and really beautiful story of what African American food looks like.
So interesting. You had mentioned that it's largely plant-based, but when we think of, like you said, the stereotypical, we think, fried foods. Where did or even, I always thought of collard greens as, and we'll get into this later, being cooked with, that pork or the ham hock, things like that. So if you look at people who are struggling to get by and they have to scrape out every calorie they can from the food they have, fat, comes in handy, right? When you're living a life where you're calorically always like struggling for more calories, you want those calories. So does the history of like fried food or parts of that, the pig, like the ham hock being used to embellish recipes, does that come from just this desire to like get calories in an easy, inexpensive, efficient way? Is that where that comes from?
I think it comes more so, I'll touch it on the ham hock side. It comes more from what they were used to. Like if we go back to the monotony of their diet, like that pork is what the slave masters gave the enslaved, and they gave them the parts that they didn't want to eat. And so they were used to eating pork. And also they didn't have as much seasoning. And so pork was a way, like these fats were a way to season and flavor the food. So it was really, I think, more the flavor part when it comes to like the pork, like adding it into the greens, because they didn't have access to like all of these, seasonings and flavorings that they could use. But this was one way that they could add flavor to their food. So that was a big part of why, like in a lot of vegetables, they could, they add like pork or some type of meat into just to add that flavor. And that goes back as well to the West African culture. A lot of cultures, especially the coastal West African regions, they did a lot of smoking of their meat. And so smoking was a way to add flavors into their food. And you can kind of see that in certain traditions when we're cooking greens. For instance, you can add a ham hock into the greens, or I know my grandmother adds a smoked turkey leg. And so that's kind of like a healthier option because it's not as fatty as the pork, but it's adding that smoky flavor as well. And it's still a similar preparation method. So I think it wasn't really to get more calories. It was just what they had access to and what they knew to add more flavor. So it was a flavor thing, I think mainly, and a comfort thing as well. Soul food, which is like the fried chicken, is more of a comfort thing and an affirmation if we look at the history of what soul food actually means. So, and I can expand more about that, but it really it was a political statement at one point in history, soul food. And so I think that is deeper than just something they ate. It had meaning to it.
So tell me, like, what's that? What's the story of soul food then?
Yeah, so basically soul food evolved from like these rations that they had, and it shows how they were able to take these rations and create something, bigger out of it. And as they had greater access to food, they were able to turn just the hominy that we see into like cornbread. They were able to raise their own chicken and fry their chicken. And chickens were actually one of the few animals that enslaved Africans could even own. And so that's why chicken became really a staple part of African American cuisine. And so when we understand how their ingenuity and their creativeness aided in their resilience, that's a part of the culture that we don't want to neglect or overlook. And so during the Black Power movement, this was one way that African Americans were able to like say, oh, our ancestors were resilient. Like this is the food that our ancestors grew up on. And so they were purposely cook soul food to really just support and affirm how far they've come and what their ancestors ate and how they survived, how it was part of their resilience. And so, people don't eat soul food every day. And so that's why I hate it when soul food becomes like the billboard for what African American cuisine is, because that is a huge part of African American, but that's not all it is. And like I said, it's part of our affirmation, it's part of our history, it's part of our resilience, but it's so much more too.
When you were a kid growing up, because I started the show by saying that, your love of food really sprung from cooking in the kitchen with your mom. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to the podcast can relate to that because it's certainly the way I grew up. Not my sisters, interestingly. They were picky eaters and never hung out in the kitchen. This just goes to show you people that when you hang out with your parents in the kitchen, it really does make you love food and nutrition a lot more and you become much more passionate about it. But what was it like when you were growing up? You've got all these siblings. Sounds like there was a lot of cooking going on. So what were the kinds of things that you cooked with your mom? And what was like a typical, dinner? And what did family dinner look like in your household?
Okay, that's a good question. So, like I said, soul food was like reserved for Sunday. And so on the Sundays, my mom, she actually still does this. Like, she will cook like a pork chop, fried chicken. Now she's doing air fried chicken, by the way. Her air fryer. But she'll cook, different meats. But like I said, a lot of vegetables. So sides are a really big thing in Southern African American culture. So green beans, succotash, corn, yams, sweet potatoes, yams, same thing. Rice, potatoes. Like my mom would cook at least 5 to 6 sides. So the starchy vegetables and the non-starchy vegetables. And so that was traditional Sunday dinner. Throughout the week, we would have less soul food type meals. And like salmon croquettes was a favorite within our family. Catfish, sometimes she'll fry it, sometimes she would grill it. So fish was a huge part of our meals growing up. And sometimes we would have breakfast for dinner. I love when my mom would fix breakfast for dinner. And of course, she had grits. Grits was a really big part of our breakfast. I love grits. There's a big debate in the South. Like, do you put sugar in your grits or do you put salt in your grits? Do you like sweet or savory grits? So some people like sugar grits. But our family, it wasn't sugar. It was more butter and salt. But so during the week, my mom did cook all the time. And I would make the desserts, by the way. So I thought I wanted to be a pastry chef because my mom would, handle all, especially on Sundays, she would do all the, the meats and sides, and I would do the dessert. And we had at least 2 desserts. It wasn't just like one thing. We had at least 2. And I think that really just stems back from her influence from my grandmother. My grandmother had a big family and she made big meals. And this is just passed down. But what I learned like growing up, that my friends, they didn't have the same experience. And that's where I began to see the disconnect in some families, like disconnect to food and culture, which was really perpetuated by like fast foods and things of that nature. Like my friends would be surprised if I told them like we only ate fast food on Friday, like a treat for us. And it was the opposite for them. And that's when I began to see, and I didn't notice it then, but like looking back, I see that some families began to really just be disconnected from cultural foods. And it was because of this like food slums and food deserts and all of these systemic practices that really help play a role in why we're disconnected from cultural foods today.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I totally see where you're coming from. Totally, makes sense to me. You mentioned something about your mom making fried chicken in the air fryer, and I don't have an air fryer yet. I must get one, but you as a dietitian, if you're counseling or talking to a patient, I talked about my sister being like handed this ridiculous list that she could not relate to. But when you're, counseling somebody who say grew up traditional, African American cuisine, what you've just described, and especially some of those celebratory foods. But say this person has high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes, and now you're working with this person to get the salt down, or get some calories out of the diet because maybe their weight loss is a goal. How do you do that in a way where you still celebrate those traditional foods and foodways without, how do you do it in a healthy way, but without ruining their fun, and their traditions?
Right. I say I always emphasize small changes. People sometimes don't realize how big of an impact small changes make, and they're easier to, sustain as well. So small changes, for instance, could be switching the type of seasoning to use. I know within a lot of Black families and Black cultures that Lawry's, the seasoning, is a huge staple. Like they put Lawry's on everything. But thankfully now Larry's has a low sodium version, so maybe swapping out the traditional Larry's with the low sodium version. Or teaching how you can add more herbs and less seasoning salt could be some way to help someone who has hypertension. Another thing could be simply encouraging the meat in three. That's really a staple in the South, like having a meat in three. And so really encouraging a meat in three.
When you say three, do you mean three sides?
Right. So it's called a meat in three. And so the three is ice. And so when you're talking about a meat in three, encourage the patient to have two non-starchy sides and one starchy side. And so that will really help someone who may have high blood sugar, who needs to manage their carbohydrate intake. So still, highlighting and recognizing the way they maybe structure their meals, but showing them how to do it with a small change. Like really small changes can make a big difference. And also just encouraging, for instance, maybe they're using canned vegetables, so maybe rinse your vegetables, or show them how to pick their own greens and not use the canned greens, or things of that nature. So those are little small things. And if you have access to an air fryer, try the chicken in the air fryer. My mom actually likes air fryer. I was surprised. I was really surprised, but she tried it, So really just encouraging small changes, because there doesn't have to be a lot of big changes, like I said, because it is a heavily plant-based diet. So just trying to highlight those inherent healthy parts of the traditional food.
Very good. Very good. So I'm trying to be really snazzy here and do a screen share for those people who are watching. Other people who are listening can go to the show notes, because I want to talk about your recipe for Smoky Collards. And let's see. Why is that for me? Oh, here it is. No, that's the shrimp and grits. I'm sure you can see it right now. Here we go. Smoky Collards. So anybody watching will see the Smoky Collards recipe pop up on their screen. But if you're listening, go to the show notes, because you mentioned this meat and three. I'm a Yankee. I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York. I never had grits till I moved to Georgia. I worked at CNN in 1987 to 1992. And I can remember going to this traditionally like Southern restaurant and getting grits. I literally had no idea what grits were. And when we talk about the shrimp and grits recipe, I will tell everybody that I did not buy the Bob's Red Mill initially. I bought like Quaker or, one of these, companies. I just bought like grits and it was like horrible. But once I discovered the Bob's Red Mill, I'm looking at it. The Bob's Red Mill, I'll put this in the show notes. Oh my gosh, so ridiculously yummy. You could put a stick of butter in there. I see where you're going with that. So you got to back off. But let's talk about your collards, because I did not have collard greens till I moved to the South. And I remember going back to Atlanta a few years ago, and they had this cool farmer's market I went to. And they were selling all sorts of veggies. And one of the farmers was selling collard greens. I have never seen such giant bunches of greens in my life. It's a rough green. It's not like a lettuce where you just eat it. It's like hearty. You got to slow cook it. A little patience. You got to soften those leaves. So I thought you could maybe just tell everybody about the ingredients in your Smoky Collards. And I will tell everybody that there is no ham hock in this, which is Sade's brilliance, because you have cut the sodium and you've cut the fat, but boy, do these taste good. So can you tell everybody like what's in this recipe? And then we'll talk about how to make it.
Yeah. So in, like you mentioned, no meat. So this could for vegetarians or vegans or just any meat lovers too. But it has onions. So you're going to flavor it with onions and garlic, and also cook it in a vegetable stock. And so you could actually use a chicken stock or a low sodium chicken stock, but I chose to use a low sodium vegetable stock. And also season it with the Larry's that I mentioned as well, and the cayenne pepper. So cayenne is a really big part of African American cuisine. Peppers like blackberry white pepper, cayenne pepper, those are big seasonings within the cuisine. Paprika as well. And so what I'm seasoning the greens with is going to make a difference, because the greens are going to soak in all these flavors. And so I was really intentional about what kind of flavors to seasoning it with garlic as well. Garlic, paprika, and cayenne are going to be in a lot of African American cuisine dishes. And so these go into the smoky collard greens. And I'm intentional about using smoked paprika to add to that smoky flavor, and also adding some smoked salt to this. I didn't put this on the recipe, but you could also use with smoke to add some smokiness. And you can do all of this to add flavor that you want, because you aren't adding a ham hock. So you really have to add the flavor with the seasonings. And you can, as you can see, and as you will taste, you can do that. Like herbs and spices, they can really amp up the flavor of the greens. And I also add a little brown sugar to it, just a little bit, because collard greens can have like a kind of like a bitter taste. So just kind of break up that bitterness. Sometimes people actually mix their greens, so maybe do a collard and a turnip to kind of help balance out that bitterness. But I'm just using collards in this recipe. And so that's the basis of the collard green recipe.
And just so people know too, for this recipe, you call for 2 pounds of collard greens. You say cleaned and picked. Now, I'm a Yankee, so define cleaned and picked, please.
Yes. I forget sometimes. So you can actually don't have to even worry about what that means, and you can buy the greens already picked in the store. But if you get the bunches of collard greens, you'll see it has the stem and all, that part, and you don't want to cook all of the stem. And so picked greens is basically removing that really thick stem part of the greens and just breaking up the leaves into smaller pieces so it can, cook really nicely. It's gonna cook down, but just removing that really bulky part of the stem and breaking up some of the leaves.
And if you have kids at home, this is a good thing for kids to do, because they're like ripping the leaves off the stem and then ripping the leaves again, and then you're going to wash them and dry them, just like a salad spinner. It's like one of my favorite little gadgets in the kitchen. And then you saute up the onion, you cook the garlic, you add the vegetable stock and all these seasonings, and then you submerge the collard greens into the pot, and you simmer this for 45 minutes to an hour until those greens are tender. And so, a little patience, right? Do you keep the lid on or off? Remind me on this.
You keep the lid on. And so with a lot of the greens and a lot of vegetables you'll see in African American cuisine is cooked low and slow a lot of times. And so because you're cooking it low and slow, the end result of the greens, you have a pot liquor. So after it boils for 45 minutes to 1 hour, the liver broth is called a pot liquor. And back during the times of enslavement, the slave masters would give the enslaved the pot liquor and keep the greens for themselves. But what they didn't know that a lot of the nutrients leach out into the pot liquor. And so the enslaved were getting a really nutritious part of the greens. And so if we go back to, maybe ways to encourage healthier habits, you could encourage your client to not to throw away the broth, to, consume that pot liquor, because you can get a lot of nutrients in that. Just make sure it's not a lot of sodium within the broth. And so you use sodium seasonings or less salt or eliminate the pork and replace it with something else that can kind of help decrease the sodium intake.
I like that. And, when I made the collard greens, I also made the shrimp and grits at the same time. That's what we did during your cooking class. And when I recreated this recipe, by the way, for some friends who came to dinner, and one happens to be a chef. And so he loved it, which is a testament to these recipes. That's how much I love the recipes. But the pot liquor I used to just sort of drizzle over the shrimp and grits, so I had the collard greens. It was all like in one bowl. Ridiculously delicious, I will say. And, it's the kind of thing you think, oh my gosh, 45 minutes, but you're just going to cover it and walk away. So it's not like you have to baby it. You just let it go. So I love that. I love that recipe. And inexpensive. Collard greens are inexpensive. And, so big bang for your buck. I mean, so much nutrition in those veggies. Love that. So the next recipe that I want to talk about, and I'm going to pull that one up, this is so cool that I can use Zoom here for my interviews. I'm like, I'll do a screen share. I don't have to print all this. So let me find, here we go, shrimp and grits. Here we go. There it is. So I made a full screen. So the shrimp and grits, which I served with the collard greens. Oh my gosh, so good. All right. So you start off by making grits. And as I mentioned, I use this Bob's Red Mill yellow corn grits, also known as polenta, right? Which is Italian. So we see this is in two very different cuisines, but yet they both enjoy the grits. So who knew grits and polenta? They're the same thing. So how do you make grits that are not wallpaper paste like I did the first time I made them? What's your secret?
The secret is using what you cook the grits in. And so you can cook the grits in water, but that's no fun. And so for this recipe, I cooked it in chicken stock. Traditionally, I know a lot of people may cook it with half and half and a little water. And so a lot of cream base, but I was trying to cut down on the fat. And so I chose to cook it in some chicken stock and a little 2% milk just to add a little creaminess to it. But that's going to really flavor the grits because the grits is going to absorb all that chicken stock. And so cooking it in something other than water really helps give it more flavor. And grits you use really helps as well. And then you want to just add a little butter. I didn't want to use a substitute for the butter. So I just did a tablespoon. But like I said, I could cut down on the cream, the heavy cream and all that. So that's the most traditional, is using a lot of cream and fatty things to cook it in. However, you can still add flavor with less of that. And so that's what I tried to do within this recipe. So you have some chicken stock, some milk, a little bit of salt, some water, a tablespoon of salted butter, black pepper, and a cup of cheddar cheese. And this is totally optional to add cheese into your grits, but I love cheese grits. If you wanted to cut down on the fat even more, you can choose like a low fat cheddar cheese as well. So this is definitely optional. And then, so after you cook the grits, then you can cook the shrimp because, the shrimp is going to cook really. So then jump into the shrimp.
Yeah. So, and I will say with the shrimp, I always keep a bag of the peeled and deveined shrimp in my freezer. And I don't buy it pre-cooked. I buy the raw because I love to cook it. I thaw it out and I love to cook it. In fact, for dinner last night, I made something similar. I did sauteed baby spinach. I got this company, Right Rice, had sent me these rice products they make out of like lentil flour and pea flour, and they're really good. And so they're like a higher fiber, higher protein kind of a rice. So I made a bag of that rice, and then I cooked up some shrimp, and I added some smoked paprika. Thank you very much, Sadé. And it was similar, to this recipe, this kind of vibe, because this is how much I love it. So how do you season the shrimp? Because this is, to me, where like a lot of magic happened in this recipe, that the shrimp is so beautifully seasoned. So tell us about how you prepare the shrimp.
So I use mainly two ingredients to season the shrimp, with the Cajun seasoning and the paprika. And so a lot of times too, with my recipes and with like just untraditional African American cooking, they use seasoned blends. Partly one, because it's more economical, and two, we heavily season our food. So using the seasoning blends really just kind of cut down on time too, so you don't have to, buy so many seasonings. But African American food is really, really heavily seasoned. And this Cajun seasoning basically has things like garlic powder, onion powder, cayenne pepper, black pepper, a lot of peppery seasonings in it. And so a little history about Cajun culture. Cajun culture are exiles French Acadians that lived in Louisiana. And they were heavily influenced by like Native Americans and African Americans living in that region. And you can see that influence within the Cajun seasoning. Like I said, you see a lot of those peppery seasonings within that Cajun seasoning blend. And so you could definitely just buy those peppers and cayenne and garlic and all those things separately, or you just get the Cajun seasoning. So that's what I did here, and added some more smoked paprika, because smoked paprika is like one of my favorite seasonings to use.
Love it. Oh my gosh, I'm hooked on it now because of you.
And I believe in most Cajun seasonings, paprika, there is some paprika in it, but not smoked paprika. So I just added a little extra, but the smoked.
And you've got onion and garlic and a little more chicken stock and a little bit of flour. You can use cornstarch. And so you've got these shrimp that you've kind of dredged in the seasoning, and then you just cook them in a skillet. So you've got, the collard greens bubbling, you've got the grits going, you're sauteing up this beautifully seasoned shrimp. So easy. I guess you could use chicken if you wanted to. You could probably use anything if you wanted to. And then you throw in a handful of baby spinach because you are the nerdy dietitian. You told me that earlier. I'm a nerdy dietitian. So you're adding even more vegetables to this dish.
Right. Yeah. And just adding some more greens. You can't have too many greens. And the thing about it, I think like when I was recipe testing, like this isn't traditional. You don't traditionally see spinach and shrimp and grits. But I wanted to add spinach because it wilts nicely, and so it doesn't seem like such a drastic change to a traditional dish, but it still adds another level of flavor. Like I love the flavor that the spinach adds to the grits, and I actually let some of my friends try it, and they really liked it too. And so I just added the spinach, or if you don't even want to add the spinach, you could just add some of those greens that you have cooking. But just to add more of those plant-based foods that we really want to highlight within the culture.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I will encourage everybody to head on over to the show notes because I love those recipes. Before we wrap it up, you had mentioned before, we could talk all day, but you mentioned before that when you were growing up and hanging out with your mom, are you living back home now, by the way? Do you live with her again?
Yes, it's so nostalgic.
Oh, so you're just like, I need the food.
Yeah, I just moved back. Yeah. So I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and so I just moved back in November. So it's really weird. I haven't lived like home in like almost 7 years, I think. So it's been a while, but yeah, it's very nice. And so I actually plan on sharing more of my recipes now living back home and us kind of exchanging because we have two different cooking styles. But that just shows the diversity of African American styles because there is so many different ways. So just really blending both of our cooking styles together, that's going to be really fun to continue to do.
You guys, you should have a blog. You should totally have a blog.
Oh, that would be nice.
Or write a cookbook or something. You got to do something.
Yeah, that's definitely on the list. The cookbook is definitely on the list.
Yeah, you should. I'm very picky when it comes to recipes. I say this on the podcast all the time. I hate wasting time on a recipe if it doesn't work and doesn't taste great. And I'm always like tweaking and changing and definitely your recipes are great. And, even the collard greens that you mentioned having that little bit of bitterness, because when I made them the second time, I noticed that. And so definitely that brown sugar just kind of, or a little honey or something just takes like the edge off that just a teeny bit, but super yummy. So just to wrap this up, what's your favorite dessert to make and how do you put your dietitian spin on it? So it stays traditional, but maybe it's all, is it okay to say a little bit healthier? I'm not even sure if it's cool to say that anymore, but to me, it's healthier if you add goodness to it, but that's my definition. So do you have a recipe that you can sort of just, you don't have to give us all the details on it, but something you like to make?
I have something I like to make, but none of it I make healthier.
Okay.
I just say eat it in moderation.
Right. Okay. No, I like this. Eat it in moderation or smaller portion. Yeah.
Yeah. Smaller pieces. Yeah. I still do like cheesecake is like one of my favorite things to make. And I don't even know, this may not even be really Southern, but red velvet cake too. Red velvet cake is one of my favorites. I guess this is how I make it Southern. I have a red velvet cheesecake that I love. So I combine like that Southern traditional red velvet cake with the cheesecake, and it's divine. And so the top layer is the cheesecake. The top layer is the red velvet cake, then the cheesecake, then the Oreo crust. And so that's like my specialty.
my eyes are popping. Growing up, because my mother's upbringing was more sort of Eastern European in nature. And she has a home economics degree from NYU. So she studied that. And then she was a home ec teacher in elementary school because I used to teach it back then. My mom, she never cooked with any spices. She just never liked spices, no pepper. If there was pepper, it was like a minuscule. So very mild cooking and, very sort of, again, traditional kind of more Eastern European with a French flair, because that was very popular for the homemakers, back in the 50s and 60s, but never ate anything peppery. I mean, smoked paprika. Oh, she did use paprika for the red color. That always, paprika on a chicken or something. But I don't think my mother would ever use smoked paprika. I'm going to visit her this week and I'm going to bring her some and we'll see if we can, she's 89, she's going to be 89. So I'm not sure you could teach an old dog new tricks. And I never had red velvet cake either. So that must be very Southern.
Yeah, it's very good. And a lot of people, even people who live in the South or had a red velvet cake, they don't realize that you put cocoa powder, like it's technically a chocolate cake. Like you just cook it a little differently, cocoa powder in it, and you just use the red food coloring. But really good, really it's probably something to make like at least once a month growing up, the red velvet cake. When I got a little bit more advanced, that's when I started playing around with like the red velvet cheesecake.
That's so funny. And I think I've heard people doing a beet red velvet cake. So they don't put the food color in, but they'll use beets.
That's a good tip. Yeah, I have to try that next time.
I think as the dietitian, you might need to try that.
Yes.
And report back. Send me the rest when you create it. So where can people find you online and on social media? And you do have a podcast as well. So tell us the name of your podcast and then where people can find you.
People can find me in a lot of places. So my Instagram is Sadé Meeks with 2 S's on my last name. So that's SADEMEEKSS. And Grit's Instagram is grits_inc. Grit's website is gritsinc.org. I actually have 2 podcasts. So I didn't talk about this, but I'm a writer as well. And so my second podcast, Grow with the Flow, is more of my artsy writing side, and my inspiration side comes out a little bit more. And so things that I write about, I speak about on that. That's how I Grow with the Flow. And then Grits has a podcast.
I did not know Grits had a podcast.
Yes. So it's the last season was like in 2020. So we haven't put out any new episodes as of yet. But with things revamping with this webinar series, stay tuned.
Stay tuned. In the show notes, I will put links, to all of this. And why do you have 2 S's on the end of your Instagram?
I think my name was taken. Yeah, I think my name was taken, and so I just added another S.
Because I'm thinking to myself, did I spell her name wrong? Because I've,
No, it's just spelled with 1 S.
Oh, that is so funny. It's like, yeah, when somebody steals your name on Instagram because it's their name as well, that's a bummer. They beat you to it. Well, Sadé Meeks, thank you. With 1 S, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
This was fun. And to all of my listeners, I always say this: if you love the show, tell a friend about it or post a review on, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Head on over to the show notes, episode 101. I know, hard to believe. Been a journey. And I hope you enjoyed the show. The recipes are going to be there. I want you to try these recipes. They will not disappoint. And as always, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.